My name is Bonnie Woodrum. I am the Community Affairs Supervisor at the Elsinore Valley Municipal Water District. Today, we invite you to learn more about EVMWD's budget as staff shares with the board the proposed budget for the 22-23 fiscal years. This is an informational meeting for the community and not an agendized meeting. In this 3-session series, we will cover topics from everything from water to wastewater, water supplies, compliance, staffing, maintenance, and development. This is our third presentation in the series, and tonight we will focus on reserve funds or savings and proposed rates. We welcome your questions this evening. You will notice a chat button at the bottom of your screen. Please click the chat button on your screen to submit questions throughout the session as you think of them, or email them to me at bwoodrum@evmwd.net. We will answer these questions at the end as time permits. We will also post answers to these questions we receive at evmwd.com/budget. I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Mr. Robert Hartwig, the Assistant General Manager for Business Services at EVMWD. Mr. Hartwig joined EVMWD in 2015 and serves as the Assistant General Manager, assisting with carrying out board directives and assuring compliance with EVMWD policies in the areas of finance, customer service, and information technology. Mr. Hartwig has overseen several budget processes here at the district, and in his tenure, he will share some of his insight tonight with how EVMWD continues to ensure safe, reliable, clean water for our customers each and every day. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Hartwig. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight to our third and final budget overview meeting. Tonight, we'll be covering these 4 areas. The top 2 we're going to just do briefly. Those have been presented twice before at a couple of other presentations. Please feel free to go onto the website if you'd like a little more detail in either of these 2 areas. Tonight's emphasis is going to be on district reserves and on proposed rates. Again, if you've been with us before, you've seen this slide. These first 3 arrows you see here are where we have been so far. The 4th arrow, April, May, is where we are at right now. The rate study was completed just a couple of weeks ago, and the public hearing notice, what we call the 218 notice, actually went out in the mail today. So you should be seeing that in your mailboxes here in the next few days. Tonight's meeting is the precursor to next month when we will have a public hearing that is scheduled for June 24th. I'll mention this several times throughout the presentation at 6 p.m. And at that meeting, we're also expecting board action on the budget and on rates. Also, we've seen this before. This is the budget presentation schedule. The first several lines there are where we've been. Tonight, we are at the very bottom. This is the last of the community presentations that we're making. And then also a few lines up, you'll notice that the Proposition 218 notice mailing is also occurring today. And then again, the budget hearing on June 24th. This slide gives you a quick reminder of the district's beginnings and the growth of the district. We've grown from a very small organization with a very low population to the large water district that you know today. And let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. This is a map of our water system. Our water system is almost 100 square miles in size. We serve from Murrieta down in the lower right corner, all the way up to Corona in the upper left corner. And we serve from Paris in the upper right corner down into portions of Orange County in the lower left corner of this slide. You can see a couple of water treatment plants. Those are the biggest items on there, Canyon Lake and Back Basin. And then you can also see where our pump stations, reservoirs, and wells are located. So let's move on to the next slide. Just a brief recap of the water system. We have 157,000 customers. We have 46,000 customer accounts, domestic water connections. We have 2 drinking water treatment plants. We have 68 storage tanks. We have 57 pump stations, 14 active wells, and almost 750 miles of pipeline. And obviously, with all of those facilities, that we've spent a lot of money building this water system, and we will show you that in just a couple of slides. Go on to the next slide. Again, a map of our wastewater system. The same boundaries as the water system, but you can see different facilities, 3 wastewater plants and several lift stations. Let's go ahead and move on. Again, a brief recap here. We have 3 wastewater treatment plants. We have 37 lift stations. We treat about 7.2 million gallons of water on an average day. And of that water that we treat, about 5.5 million gallons a day goes into Lake Elsinore as stream water quality water on the other end. We have 37,000 sewer service accounts and about 415 miles of sewer pipeline here. We can move on. Now, obviously, I've just talked to you about an awful lot of infrastructure or buildings and equipment. That infrastructure cost us almost $1 billion to build, $988 million to build. And that's the historic cost. If we had to replace all of that, obviously it would cost a lot more than that in today's dollars. All of that has been financed with some long-term borrowing and some cash-funded financing. We call that pay-as-you-go financing. Our long-term borrowing, we currently owe about $161 million. You can think of that, if we owe $161 million on $988 million in assets, you can think of that as if you had a $48,000 mortgage left to pay on a $300,000 house. So we have a lot of equity in our water and wastewater system. And because of that strong financial position, it puts us in a situation where we're able to obtain some very high bond ratings. We're at AA and AA plus. There's only one rating higher, and that's AAA. And then we have those higher ratings help us to achieve lower interest whenever we have to issue debt. And it also results in other reduced bond costs when we have to issue debt. We supplement that financial condition by going out and trying to get grants. We've received about $13 million in grant revenue since 2017. And we also have about $221 million that will be coming up or that is already in place in the form of low interest loans. And those low interest loans, some of those are at 0% interest. Some of those are, a lot of those are at less than 1% interest. And then we actually have some of those loans that are actually forgiven if we meet certain criteria in the debt financing. Overall, these additional financing sources save us about $86 million in either future interest savings or in the form of loan forgiveness. Looking at the 2 graphs on this slide, you can see the top one is our operating budget, our operating expenses. This does not include our debt service on this particular portion of the graph. We have the water fund is the biggest of our funds. The wastewater is next. Recycled water is a very, very small fund. And then we also have some general and administrative costs. Those costs are for departments like mine. We serve both the water and the wastewater and the recycled water areas. And so our costs are shown separately here, but then at the end of the year, we get allocated out between water and wastewater and recycled water. On the non-operating expense budget, that's almost $100 million this year. Again, about 13 million in debt service. The biggest portion is capital improvements. We'll talk about that a little bit later tonight. And then we have some small other expenses like interest expense and things like that. So let's move on to the next page. We'll talk about this again later, but I wanted to briefly show you that we had 4 really large challenges in this year's budget. One was imported water. The Canyon Lake Water Treatment Plant is currently offline because of what's a chemical constituent that is known as PFAS or PFAS. And that means we have to buy more imported water. And when you combine that with the fact that our imported water costs are increasing, Metropolitan Water District has increased the rates that they charge us to buy that imported water. That's been a significant cost pressure in this year's budget. Another one is electrical costs. Southern California Edison with their price increases. We have some employee obligations in the terms of contractual increases. These are from employment contracts. We have additional costs from the state of California in terms of pension costs. They tell us we have to pay a certain amount of money, and that is the amount we have to pay. And then we also have our health, dental, and other types of insurance. We actually go out and look for ways to save money in this area. And as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, we switched to a different insurance provider in order to save some costs in this particular area. And then finally, costs of compliance. And the major item here, and we'll talk about this a little bit further in the presentation, is the Regional Water Reclamation Plant Repair and Rehabilitation Project. Next slide, please. So with that background, let's move into talking about reserves. We will talk about restricted funds in general, and our reserves are part of those restricted funds. So our restricted funds, again, include things like our reserves. There are some other areas too. We'll go into that on the next couple of slides. But why we have restricted funds? We have them because they help us to plan for our future needs. They give us the ability to look into the future as opposed to having to respond to everything in the present immediately. So it allows us some chances to plan for the future. They smooth out the effects of large expenditures. They avoid any sharp changes in our rates to our customers. They allow us to handle unplanned and emergency situations, and they are required by law or by covenant or by our administrative code. Let's go into the first area. First area are what we call restricted funds. These are section 2951 of the administrative code. There are 3 types of restricted funds that are talked about in that section of the code. These are established and used for very narrowly defined purposes, and again, are required by law or by covenant. The first of these is capacity charges. You can see that's $34 million. And that's used to pay to enlarge our system. And those capacity charges come from our developers. They do not come from ratepayers. So the ratepayers do not pay for any of the costs associated with new development. So that's what the capacity charges are for. The second item are employee benefits. These are things like pension, insurance, and other obligations that we have. We are required to set money aside to make sure that we pay the bills when they come due for our different employee benefits, and that balance is about 4.6. And then the last item there is the debt obligations. And what we do there is we have to have enough money to pay for 1 year's debt service on certain of our bond issues. That's required by the bond covenants. So in order for the bond holders to buy our bonds from us, they said, you have to set this money aside. So that's what that balance is for. Let's move along. The next area is capital replacement funds. This is covered by section 2952 of the Administrative Code. These funds are established by the board, and they're used to build or repair our big infrastructure projects, what we call CIP or capital improvement projects. You can think of this as money that we've set aside to pay for future improvements. And we have three different kinds of capital replacement funds. One is what we call the capital replacement fund. It pays to repair our existing buildings and our large pieces of equipment like our lift stations and our pump stations and our pipes and things like that. All of this is paid for by our ratepayers. You can think of this as money that we have set aside to replace our roof or our windows or our driveway if we had a house instead of a water district. So you can kind of put it in those terms if you're thinking about your own personal life. It's money that we've set aside to pay for those future needs of the district. The second item here is our general and internal service funds. We have $3 million set aside for this area, and this is to replace our equipment. So when our vehicles wear out or when our computers wear out or things like that, that's what that money is paid from. And then last is our water purchases. We have a lease with Canyon Lake Property Owners Association, the CLPOA. That lease allows them to use the lake for recreational purposes. They pay us lease revenue every year, and a portion of that revenue has to be set aside to purchase water in case the lake level goes below a certain amount. And that's the amount of money that we have in that replacement fund. All right, we can move on to the next slide. The last area of our reserve or our restricted funds are our operating funds. This is section 2953 of the Administrative Code. These operating funds make sure that the district remains financially sound. We have three different types, and I'm going to actually talk about them in the order of the operating reserves first, the last item second, and then the middle item will be third. So first, let's talk about operating reserves. Operating reserves are a set percentage of our expenses, in this case, 20%. Our bondholders have also required that we put this money aside. It's so that they know that we're going to be able to pay our operating bills. It amounts to about 70 days of district operations. So for a little over 2 months, they know that we've got cash set aside to pay our bills in case no money comes in. Obviously, it would have to be a pretty major situation for no money to come in, but it is required by our bondholders, and we do have to maintain that reserve. The third one that you see there, the $3 million item, is another one that also is required by bondholders. This one is a part of the bond covenants, and you can think of this as a rainy day fund. It handles emergency and crisis type situations. And finally, the rate stabilization reserve. This is the $17.8 million item, and I'm going to actually talk about that on the next slide. So looking at the next slide, you can see that there are two major types of rate stabilization reserves. One is water and the other is wastewater. We do have a small recycled water reserve, but again, that's a very, very small fund. So I'm going to talk about these two big ones here tonight. You can see a couple of things here. First of all, our goal for these reserves, they are set by the board. The board wants these reserves to be between 15 and 30%. Again, you can see a couple of things. First of all, you can see on that water reserve, the top graph, it fluctuates quite a lot over time. It fluctuates a lot more than the wastewater reserve, which you see is fairly level over that same period of time. The reason that the wastewater tends to be level is that we can pretty much count on the same flows going into the plant, the same expenses for the plant. We can count on the same revenues coming in from our customers. The bills remain the same pretty much for wastewater bills from month to month to month. And as a result, you don't see a lot of changes in that particular one. But on our water side, the cost of water depends on the weather. We may have to buy more water if it's very dry. We may not have to buy much water at all if it's very wet. We have to, if the water plant is offline like it is right now, we're going to have to buy more water, and imported water is much more expensive than the water we produce out of the water plant. We have to know whether or not our wells are producing or not. If the wells are down, or if the back basin plant is down, something like that, that will have an impact on these, on this particular reserve as well. The second thing that you'll notice on this graph is that the water reserves have tended to fluctuate around 15% and are actually at the low level of the 15 to 30% that the board would like them to be at. The wastewater, you'll notice, is much higher than the 30%. That was actually a decision that was made a couple of years ago. We knew that the state was going to require us to do repairs and rehabilitation on the regional wastewater treatment plant. We knew that that was going to add about $4 million per year to customer costs in the form of the debt service needed to pay off the debt to build that repair and rehabilitation project. That's about a $40 million project. So in order to smooth out the effect of that $4 million a year, the board planned to keep the reserves higher for the past couple of years, and then to start using those reserves over the next couple of years to help offset some of those rate changes that would be needed for the wastewater fund when that debt started to have to be repaid. So it's high now. It will be coming down into that 15 to 30% range over the next few years. So let's go to the next page. So speaking of rates, we've talked about rates on the last couple of slides. That moves us into the next part of tonight's discussion, and that is the rates. This first slide that you're looking at right now is something that you saw at the last presentation if you were in attendance at the last presentation, and that's also available online if you haven't seen it. I'm going to focus on two numbers from this slide. The first one is the current year budget. The current year budget is about, let's just say, $88 million. 2 years from now, that proposed budget is $100 million. This is our operating budget. And you can see that's about a $12 million increase. 100 minus 88 is 12. It's actually about $11.7 million when you start to go further into the calculations. So we've got an $11.7 million budget increase over the next 2 years, and that is very significant. And I've talked to you before, and we'll talk to you again about what's causing those increases. Let's go ahead and move on to the next page, and we will talk about those increases. Again, we talked about this earlier. This is the same slide you saw earlier. Those imported water costs that I talked to you about, the Canyon Lake Water Treatment Plant going offline and the additional MET costs, that has added $4.2 million to the budget over the next 2 years. Electric costs between Southern California Edison rate increases and the fact that we're going to have to operate our wells more because Canyon Lake Water Treatment Plant is offline. It's generating about another $1.3 million in costs. Again, our costs of compliance, that regional rehabilitation project that I was talking to you about, the debt service on that, $4.1 million just to comply with the current wastewater treatment standards. And finally, the employment obligations, that's about $2.1 million. So you add up 4.2 million plus 1.3 million plus 4.1 million plus 2.1 million, and you get $11.7 million. Now, it would be incredibly convenient if that's the way that the budget worked out, but we actually had another $1.2 million in cost increases elsewhere. And we were asked by our general manager and by the board of directors to offset those cost savings. And so we looked at our non-contractual accounts. Our budget is very much oriented towards contracts, but we do have a small portion of our budget, about 10 to 12% of our budget, that is non-contractual. And we looked in there and we were able to come up with about $1.2 million in savings in those non-contractual accounts. And we'll actually talk about that on the next slide, but that offset that additional 1.2 million in increases over and above those that you've just seen on this past slide. So I was telling you again about the $1.2 million in cost reductions. That offset $1.2 million in other increases that were not shown on that previous slide. Those reductions came in the form of legal costs, postage, maintenance, chemicals, and some other non-contractual service accounts that the district has. We try very, very hard to handle growth without adding staff. And so I'm going from the last item on this slide up to the first item on this slide. Over the past 12 years, we have seen about a 23% increase in the size of our community, the number of customers. And we have been able to handle that growth while actually reducing our staff by 2 people. So we try very hard again to handle the growth without adding staff. In addition, a reminder, another expense offset we have is that we have about $254 million in the form of grants and low interest loans. Again, 13 million in grants, most of the loans at less than 1% interest, many of them at 0% interest, and some loans are forgiven if we meet certain criteria. And then finally, one other thing that we've done to try to offset expenses this year, again, a $12 million increase in the budget is a lot. In order to minimize that effect on any sudden changes in the rates, we're proposing moving to a 4-year rate model. It's still a 2-year budget. There'll be another 2-year budget 2 years from now, but the rates will be established for 4 years in an effort to smooth out the effects of those rate changes over time. We believe that this is a wise way to go. Again, it spreads out the costs more slowly over a longer period of time, and it gives our customers a better idea of what to expect in the future. So the immediate effects of these rate changes, first of all, this shows you what the proposed rate changes are, but we want you to understand that the immediate effects will not occur until January 1 of 2022. Utility bills are usually smaller at that time of the year. And we thought that that would be a good timing, especially with the fact that we'd had the COVID emergency going on for the past year or so. The average increase is about $7.36. This would be for a family of 4. It would be for a person who is using all of their indoor allotment and all of their outdoor allotment as well. Again, to see a complete list of the calculations, you can go to our rate calculator at our website. We've talked about this website before, but you can see that on this slide. The one thing I want to let people know is that even with all of these changes, a gallon of water costs an Elsinore Valley customer less than 1 cent. And we'll go on. So with that, I'll wrap up, and hopefully we'll have time maybe for a few questions. I'd like to make a couple of final points here. The rate hearing, obviously, again, the hearing notice went out today. Again, we're considering about a $7.68 increase in the total bill. That's water and wastewater put together for our Elsinore customers. If you are a water only or a sewer only customer, that will be less than that amount. And then you need to also know that if you are in the Temescal division, which is up in the just past our north west boundary, you'll see a little bit bigger increase up there. Again, our rate hearing is scheduled for June 24th, and the proposed rates would be effective in January of 2022. And they'd probably go into, I think those would appear on February bills. Please remember that all of these amounts that we've talked about assume a family of 4 that is using their maximum indoor and maximum outdoor allotment for water. And finally, we'd like you to, oh, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. I apologize. We do have a lot of information available on our website. You can go to the website, you can see the rate study. You can see the board presentations, the community presentations. You can see the public hearing, the 218 notice itself. You can even see tonight's web presentation, and you can see the previous 2 presentations if you go to www.evmwd.com/budget. And now we will go to the final slide. Finally, I'd like to invite you to attend the public hearing. It is again June 24th, Thursday night at 6 p.m. Due to the COVID-related gathering restrictions that were in effect at the time we had to make this decision, this meeting will be held virtually. And to attend, you can go to that same website that I've given you before, and that will provide you with login information. Or you can always feel free to contact us. Our phone number is listed here, and it's also listed on your water bill. And there is also a website available called I Have a Voice at evmwd.net, where you can always contact us with any questions or comments. And with that, thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have this evening. Bonnie, have we gotten any questions this evening?
Great, thank you, Bob. Yes, we do have a question. So is this a way for EVMWD to increase profits when you're raising rates?
Actually, a very good question. EVMWD is a water district. That makes it a form of government. And as government, we cannot earn a profit. What we do is we charge for the actual costs to provide you with the water or the wastewater or the recycled water. So there's never a profit for the district. Any money that we receive is basically plowed back into the district for future improvements to the district.
Great, thank you. Another question, how would our ratepayers know that the prices or the rates that we charge are fair?
Well, that would be through the rate study itself. We hire an outside consultant. That consultant comes in and looks at all of our costs. They build those into what's known as a rate model. And for instance, the reason why you see differences in rates is because we use different types of water, or there may be facilities that have to be used for peaking if you are a higher level user of water, things like that. That's all available in that rate study. I'm not going to say that it's light reading. It's pretty heavy reading. But that gives you, I guess, the good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will. An outside consultant has taken a look at this and has said, yes, these rates are fair and reasonable for each of these different customer classes.
Great, thank you. And one more question. How would a customer be able to communicate or protest the rates that we have proposed? How would they be able to notify the board?
And another good question, that is also on the website. It's on the 218 notice that you'll receive as well. I believe that the instructions for that are near the end of that 218 notice. So you'll find them there. You'll also find them on the website. If you can't find them, or you're having trouble finding them, again, please give us a call. We want to register all of the comments, whether they are favorable towards the rates or unfavorable towards the rates. And we want to make sure that your voice is heard.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for your time this evening, Bob. And again, as Bob mentioned, we have all of this information available for you on our website at evmwd.com/budget. All of the information, the rate calculators, the 218 notices, and information with regards to these presentations is all available. Of course, we're always happy to answer your questions, and we invite you again to join us on June 24th at that virtual meeting to hear more detailed information. Thank you again for your time, Mr. Hartwig, and thank you all for joining us this evening, and we will see you on June 24th. Thank you.